This is Richard Wolff responding to another Ask Prof Wolff question from our Patreon community. And this question comes from Ray King, and it refers to the passage of Proposition 22 in California in the November election. That proposition gave Uber, Lyft, and other vehicle ride-hailing and so on service providers exemption from labor laws so that they could have their own set of rules governing their industry rather than being governed by and subject to 200 years or 150 years of labor legislation in the United States that governed what employers can and must do for employees. These labor rules were fought for by generations of workers before and after they formed unions, and have been the results of a bitter struggle. What Uber and Lyft basically are, from the beginning, is an effort to make a profit by getting around those rules. You see, the taxi business basically, long ago, worked out a deal. They had had many difficulties with taxis that weren't properly maintained, taxis that weren't properly insured, taxi drivers that weren't properly vetted or trained, and a whole host of issues that are very common in many employer-employee situations, where the employers drive for profit, which is how capitalism works, leads the employer to take all kinds of risks, all kinds of shortcuts with safety, insurance, and so on, and taxis had done that. And that had endangered, crippled, or killed their passengers, who began to be angry and bitter and demand some kind of control of this industry, or they would abandon it altogether. So a deal was hatched. Capitalism had once again undercut itself. The profit motive had made the whole commodity that they provided, rides, unpalatable, unacceptable, intolerable. So the compromise was a commission, a taxi commission set up in many cities across the country, which basically worked out a deal. If the taxi drivers and the companies that mostly hired those drivers were willing to accept pretty strict rules governing the vetting of a driver, insurance, upkeep, maintenance, and all the other basically safety provisions of the commodity, which private capitalism had not been able to assure the public of, because profit is number one, public safety a distant second. In order to get that problem solved, the Commission would impose on the industry these rules, but in response to that, give them a guaranteed, modest, but guaranteed profit. In other words, the Commission would set the taxi rates high enough so that a company could meet all the safety standards and still make a decent, if not wild, profit. All that Uber and Lyft ever were an attempt to take advantage of those high prices by charging the same, or maybe a little less, or maybe a little more, but basically using those high prices as a benchmark, while saving, which is what the original capitalists in the taxi business had always done, while saving money, i.e. earning profit, by shortcuts on vetting and insurance and upkeep. Some of those costs were shifted onto the driver, driving his or her own car, and some of them were simply saved by the money not being spent on these things. And so, of course, the cry went up, do something about this. Meanwhile, taxi drivers did not want this competition. Taxi companies didn't want this competition. No one ever does, who's a capitalist, want the competition. They say so on 4th of July speeches, how much competition is a wonderful thing, but they never want it for themselves and do everything they can to get out from under it and to become, if they can do it, a monopolist. got rid of competition. So the taxi companies didn't like it, and they began to insist that the Uber and the Lyft and people like that had to conform for the safety of the public, etc., to all the rules of how you treat workers in general and car drivers in particular that have been developed, as I say, over many, many, many decades. Uber and Lyft didn't want that because it threatened their profit. There's nothing complicated about this. But you can get a little fooled if you take seriously the public relations. The car companies cannot say, we need to make profit, so we don't want to observe what the people have fought for 100 years. I mean, that looks as bad as it sounds. So that can't be said. You have to come up with something else. You have to say things like, we're creating an opportunity for poor people to get a job, or we're creating an opportunity for black and brown people to break in, or something else. Hopefully something with a grain of truth, if you want it to be believed at all, but most of it really just so much smoke to cloud people's vision as to what's going on here. And then there's the question that if you can get an exemption somewhere, even if you have to pay extra for it, it'll be worth it because you can use an exemption somewhere to go and get a better shot at it everywhere else. So California was a shot for Uber and Lyft, and they took it. They spent upwards of $200 million, according to the press, to win this proposition, which they did, and to thereby get exemption from Uber and Lyft, which I am sure they will use to try to get it everywhere else where they don't already have it, both in and out of the United States. If, in fact, the details, which are many, long, and written in a lawyerly language that no taxi driver will ever work through, or maybe 5 will, this language, if it is anything like the existing labor law protections, would immediately raise the question, why would Uber and Lyft spend the time and the energy and take the public relations risk and take the money they would have to raise to win an election if they're going to give the workers basically the same protections under this proposition that they already have under existing labor law? They wouldn't do that, and so that's not what they're doing. And whatever the provisions of this particular one really isn't the issue, because it's the broad pattern across the country that's the issue. And the search to be able to call the driver of a Lyft and Uber car a gig contractor is fundamentally driven by the savings in the costs that generations of labor agitation have won for workers. The employers, Lyft and Uber, don't want to be bound by those rules. And if the cost of it is to be bound by them in California, they'll do it if they can get unbound from them everywhere else. So that there's a reason why a smart taxi driver cannot and will not read the fine print, because it's not about the fine print. Moreover, anything that is so complicated that you have to read lots of fine print and get a lawyer to explain it to you means that as soon as the law is passed, Uber and Lyft, like employers before them, will go after adjustments, amendments in the law, stuck into some bill with a different name on it that they can get in the next legislative session. That's all this is. And the workers are absolutely right to want to say no. They didn't estimate how much value this has for Lyft and Uber, so they didn't spend the money and the time and the energy. And they were distracted by the Trump versus Biden struggle. That's what was at stake. This is a major defeat of the working class, allowing drivers to be paid less and to be cared for less than was the norm. That's what the proposition said. You're not bound by the norms of the law. you have a little proposition all to yourself, which you can now concentrate on getting more and more out of for your profits. This is Richard Wolff for Democracy at Work.